So first of all, just Andre, so a big thank you. I appreciate you're a really busy person at the moment, but I was really keen to get you involved in the senior leadership in the EdTech sessions that we're doing at the moment, for a couple of reasons. One, because you're an entrepreneur who's just sort of starting to deliver a solution into the EdTech market, and it's good to get that side of the opinion rather than some of the maybe some more mature solutions that are out there, like we've talked about Arbor and Bromcom and other areas, but also because they are mainly MIS. So we talked to a lot of MIS companies, and I was really interested in getting somebody from a different aspect of EdTech involved in these sessions as well. And obviously you're very passionate about the sort of send area and effectively where that's your solution is ultimately going to go into. So it'd be really interesting to get a bit more about your background and how you sort of came to the point of identifying the solution and where you got to as part of being CEO of Spectrum and FullSpektrum, sorry, and why it's really important to you that basically that the actual solution you've delivered or driving in the EdTech market is really important to the customers and ultimately with EdTech, which is ultimately the children and the learners that are out there, why it's so important. So I don't know if you mind, but just give us a bit of a background about where you've come from, where you've got to the point of understanding that this is the particular solution that's required in EdTech.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts, my vision, and the platform building amongst your communication platform. I mean, it's certainly a pertinent conversation, especially now where we're entering into a pandemic where everything's moved remote, and the status quo of how children and people access information is all changed. You can change the content and delivery of content to focus on someone remotely, but how do you manage them and how do you regulate it based on the distance? So me, so founder and CEO of FullSpektrum. We're a London-based EdTech company that was formed in 2018. The concept of FullSpektrum was born out of frustration. And it was born out of my own colorful experiences in education, employment, and training, whereby I was diagnosed with being dyspraxic and dyslexic by age 21, quite late in my second university. And it wasn't picked up until then, simply because during my primary school years, I overperformed based on my engagement in the core subjects. And in secondary school, once the subjects started to diversify, there was obviously those subjects that you'd be much more engaged and much more interested in compared to others. So therefore, it compensates over various different markers and mechanisms of any type of cognition and learning difficulty. But I noticed a massive drop in my attainment levels from when I moved into sixth form. I started to study my AS and AT levels, whereby I did particularly poorly compared to what my GCSE A levels weren't so great. And that the first markers of me potentially having a learning difficulty were found where I had an eye test and they said, you might be dyslexic. Why don't you go and seek additional help? So I was 17. I requested help, and not only 5 years later, that's when I actually received my diagnosis and therefore the additional support and the provisions that came from it. Albeit the provisions that were put in place, they weren't particularly relevant to my needs. So I studied human biology and ended up having a career in life sciences, working with pharmaceutical companies, biotech, diagnostics, and really looking at it as how we can understand the elements of detecting a disease or detecting a particular biochemical and not detecting but quantifying it. Now, once I started having support in university, I was assigned a teaching assistant that came from a humanities background. And when we sat down and started to look at in terms of the subjects I need to revise because I was doing particularly poor in my exams, the first thing she said, we looked at it, is like, Andre, hold on, whoa. I don't come from a science background, I come from a humanities background. So can you teach me or show me how to approach this subject so I can help you revise it? And I thought, this is nonsense. I don't understand why they cannot understand or capture the most important need, which is that a learner support, and really engage it so that I can do well in my degree. And for me, it was all or nothing. I was facing not getting a degree. I had to do something. So I took upon liberty to research into what my learning needs and my learning requirements were. did a lot of research into neuropsychology and various mechanisms of, attainment, learning, but also delivery of education. And at the same time as well, I was also a volunteer teacher at a supplementary school run on Saturdays for Afro-Caribbean children in South London. I was a student of that from 5 years old and I came back to teach. And from the information I picked up from my studies of how to get a degree, understand where my strengths and weaknesses are based on learning and development, I wanted to use this information to support other children, because I could see it as, this is not an isolated incident. I could see there's a significant amount of children, young people that are prolifically failed by the system simply because they don't have either the resources or the insight to understand the needs and have the ability or the capability to actually take on increasing caseloads. So with that experience, I started to think of different ways in terms of how I could work with children. I could, work on the front line, work in supplementary schools or as a tutor or anything like that. But I always thought global. I always thought, I want to help children and young people who are neurodiverse all over that have similar issues, because the way I see it is where we are as a human race, we face challenges, and we're facing a significant challenge, particularly with the current pandemic. And the main type of individual that can help try to satisfy the outcomes of development, they're neurodiverse. They're the ones that think outside the box, think laterally, and think creative. Yep. So we need to find a way to get these children and people empowered so that they can really facilitate, innovation, creativity, and also social impact, which is what is needed. We spent 4 years researching into it. And then at the time where I just became a father, so my fiance was in maternity ward, about to be induced for my son to be born. I said, you know what? I have to turn this into a company. I've got to leave something for him, but also to ensure that my son and his peers don't ever go through the issues in education that I've been through. That has also affected me in my employment. And so that's where FullSpektrum was born. And that was my dedication to transform education and change, improve the quality of life and access opportunities for those unknowingly defined.
Yeah, it's interesting. So going back to the dyslexia thing, because obviously we've talked, and I've got dyslexia as well. But I think there's two. I think there's for me there's a couple of issues. I think there's one which is identifying that a child has dyslexia, and from a professional's perspective, how do you get to the point where teachers understand that children actually have dyslexia? But there's also the other problem, which is, I know when I was going through school, do I want to hide it? Yeah, of course I do. I don't want to be, I don't want to be classed as that child who's got dyslexia. Yeah. So there's two problems you try, and probably like yourself, you're doing really well at school. So ultimately you were able to hide the idea, the fact you had dyslexia, and probably in some ways you wanted to, as much as like I did. I don't know, what do you think about those?
I think the problem is a really, really good and really poignant topic that you picked up on. Particularly in this country, within British culture, we like to put labels and categories for people. We always want to put things in boxes. Yeah. It's very regimented and very conservative in terms of how we understand society, classes, races, and also mechanisms of performance. Now, with SEN, the concept of SEN has always been seen as the children that are slow, the children that are never going to perform, the children that are essentially the ones you want to sweep underneath the carpet and not include in your attainment levels, particularly in schools that are pushed forward. I've been for sixth form, I had to leave my sixth form because I didn't want their attainment levels to impact on their performance charts and everything like that. Their model was get those children out, get those young people out and focus on the ones that do well. We don't really understand nor appreciate the concept of neurodiversity in its totality. Neurodiversity is a new buzzword, a new topic that's been in discussion for the past 18 to 21 months, particularly in social media and other areas, as a method of liberation, of diversification of thoughts and understanding in terms of where different attributes can relate to impact in society. But one thing they don't really understand and not really appreciate is that there's a spectrum, there's a full spectrum of neurodiversity. You don't have just a person that you label as dyslexic or dyspraxic or have an attention hyperactivity deficit disorder or autistic or anything else. there are elements of different things that are categorized in a neuropsychological standpoint, which we can correspond to, and therefore putting a label on someone effectively demonizes the attributes. And also, one thing that we don't take into point is a concept called positive psychology. So rather than look at in terms of what you can't do, what you find difficult, what you're unable to do, let's talk about your superpower. What is your superpower? What can you do? What are you proficient in? What does your method of thinking in solving topics and seeing the world as it is bring value to not only to yourself, but to society and particular areas of subjects and within that? And so our approach has always been, we understand that there's different labels, there's different segments of special needs and whatever, which we correspond to from a legal standpoint.
Yep.
Having said that, we need to fully understand in terms of what the child's needs, their interests, and their background is for it to be truly inclusive. Because right now, diversity inclusion is a tick box mechanism, is not really to sit down and fully understand. So that's where the gap is at the moment, regards to education and also in other areas of support such as healthcare and social care, where we need to have the time, the tools and the support to truly understand and appreciate each individual based on where they are on a spectrum. And once we can identify where they are on a spectrum based on their needs, the output, their value, and the progression, then how do you then personalize it? Because one thing you've got to remember, we currently have a curriculum that was built and made for the Victorian era. It's a 19th century curriculum in the digital world. It doesn't make it. So how do we bridge that gap? It's through using technology and through really understanding the concepts of information management, diversification of information, and using those key elements and support such technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning to truly personalize the engagement, intervention and support of anyone that is neurodiverse.
So I'm going to push on this a little bit. So in some ways, based on what you're just saying, we should probably get rid of the title of SEND. There shouldn't be such thing as SEND children. We should be focusing much more on that individual learning and making sure everybody gets that, maybe an individual plan about how they can use their skill sets better. Or it could be, the areas of skill sets that need a slight amount of improving on, then fine, but actually the plan isn't a SEND plan or a statement or anything. It's literally saying you are an individual and here are your strengths and here are some areas of improvement.
Absolutely. That's exactly the type of approach that is fundamental to our mission, whereby we want to eliminate all labels and stigmas that we falsely categorize in order to facilitate political correctness on obligation or as a technical mechanism to kind of, get by and manage funds and management with progress. My perspective towards this, and it may seem controversial to many, but it's my thoughts and I really don't mind to be clear in terms of how it comes out. There's no such thing as being neurotypical. Neurodiversity is not just based on attributes, based on difficulties and limitations, based on neuropsychology. It's all based on how our nervous system, motor neurons, axons, all that's happened within our brains and the cerebral cortex, how that's all mapped. And with the mapping of that, but also the experiences we go through, the inheritance of cultures and backgrounds, everything that makes us us based on how we arrived and how we grow and how we actually provide value should all be accommodated. And it's all based on information and a propensity to collect, analyze, and assimilate information from a diversification of thought. The fact that in our culture, we always look at things based on a generic or standardized approach. You have standardized assessments, which are proven to be, disparate or non-relevant to people and children from other cultures. We do so many things based on status quo, but it's an element of ignorance, but also with ignorance comes from the lack of information or the lack of the ability to collect the information to say to service, which is understandable. But from when we are in an era where we have so much analytical technologies and cognitive computing elements in areas of finance, in science and pharmaceuticals, in everything apart from education. Why are we having a curriculum that was built and made for the Victorian era during the digital age? It doesn't make sense. And this is where us as a company, we're trying to bridge that gap by looking at education, but also health and social care as integrated concepts to facilitate learning and development, and how we actually really push the boundaries of data collection, data science, assessment, diagnosis, continuous assessment, all those things there that we can build enough of a structure of intellect to really understand how we can personalize the attributes of learning and development. And so with that, once we are able to do this, we can knock off the term neurotypical, and SEND no longer becomes an attribute. It becomes a personalized curriculum. That is our approach. And we truly believe that by understanding the cognitive and neuropsychological attributes of each person and delivering an individualized approach to learning development can bridge the gap and give opportunities to all, irrespective of their background or their ability.
I suppose the key thing is then is you're just funding, you're targeting the funding at actually almost everybody to a large degree. But and you might need to provision it. You might need to sort of map it together and say, well, these children have got similar, some similar attributes that we're going to invest in. But ultimately, that that sort of approach.